questions for oral answer. Would some honourable member care to move that the House takes note of miscellaneous business? The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
I so move. Mr Speaker, this week is of course Budget Week 2016. By this time tomorrow, Mr Speaker, Bill English will have delivered his 8th budget, Mr Speaker, and it will be a fine budget indeed. He will have almost reached the number of budgets that he has children, Mr Speaker, tomorrow afternoon. Mr Speaker, as a public service in Budget Week, I thought it would be appropriate for me to go in search of an alternative budget from the opposition. They've been saying a lot over the last few weeks, and I thought it would be helpful to draw it together into a cogent narrative as to what the alternative budget would be in 2016, Mr Speaker. Well, I think we could start. There'd have to be a budget story, and I was thinking it would probably say there was a crisis, Mr Speaker. I think it would be a crisis, because it has been indeed for the opposition a crisis every year now since this government has been in office. The manufacturing, exports, regions, Christchurch housing, milk prices, fresh fruit and vegetables, too many people leaving, too many people arriving. These are the crises that the Labor opposition have been seeking to deal with in their budgets, and I'm sure they'll come up with one tomorrow in their alternative budget, Mr Speaker. They will also need some statistics. Unfortunately, they're not proving to be particularly good at statistics. So, for example, on Sunday, Andrew Little went out and said that New Zealanders' households' share of GDP had dropped dramatically, except that he was wrong. He was wrong, Mr Speaker. If you look at the household's share of GDP, it's higher under this government than it was under Labor, Mr Speaker. And then, of course, as late as today, they're talking about home ownership. And they're saying that home ownership is dropping under this government. Well, here's an interesting statistic. According to Statistics New Zealand, home ownership in New Zealand has actually risen slightly over the last 5 years. So that's rather fascinating, Mr Speaker. But that's okay. We'll move on. We can't do stats. We'll have to talk about maybe tax. Now, there's an interesting subject, Mr Speaker, because they must have presumably a coherent position on tax. That would be a good thing. After all, in 2014, when Andrew Little became leader, he took the capital gains tax off the table. He cited it as the reason people didn't vote for us. Well, not to be put off his plan, Finance spokesman Grant Robertson this week slapped it back on the table. We need to look at a range of options, says Robertson. Capital gains tax clearly has to be one of those options. Well, he obviously hasn't told Mr Little. But then what about personal tax? Well, Grant Robertson on Monday said that Labor is planning to announce tax increases before the next election to help fund its spending plans. That's what he said. And Andrew Little said, when asked what would Labor's tax increase be for the top rate of personal tax, I think it was on ZB, he said it would not be as high as 39 cents in the dollar. That's what Andrew Little said. But then Annette King and I were on the radio this morning, and she was asked about tax and says, we've made no decisions on tax. We've made no decisions on tax. This is about as consistent as Phil Twyford on the Metropolitan Urban Limit, Mr Speaker. That's what we're doing. But that's all right. We don't know what we're doing on tax, except we know we're putting it up in the alternative budget. What about spending? What's the plan in spending, Mr Speaker? Well, it's interesting. I haven't had time to go back through all the press releases, so I've just done the Labor and Greens press releases from the past few days. So, what do we need? We need $500 million for the police. Right, okay. We need 26 weeks paid parental year by April 2018. Anything less is not good. The Greens, $1 billion nearly to electrify rail between Auckland, Hamilton and Tauranga, Mr Speaker. Now, we've got the health budget. Now, the health budget's an interesting one. Robertson says it needs to be at least $600 million. According to the Greens and the CTU, it needs to be nearly 700 million. And according to Andrew Little, it needs to be $1.7 billion in health spending, Mr. Speaker. Then there's conservation funding. The Greens want a lot more money in conservation funding. And then, of course, Bill English has to stop disciplining Housing New Zealand, so that's another couple of $100 million. And on top of that, there's the Kiwi Build program, Mr. Speaker, which is billions and billions of dollars. So all we know is what we've always known. The alternative budget is tax more, spend bucket loads, send the country down the road to rack and ruin, and that's why this government gets to deliver its 8th budget tomorrow, Mr. Speaker.